Hi everyone, this is Tanya with Flying Dog Studio. Thank you so much for joining me. In today's video, we're going to look at my recreation of a scientific botanical painting done by an artist about 100 years ago. So the first thing I did was to draw this out with a 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencil. You can use any type of pencil you like. I just kind of like that one. It has a thinner line. And then once I get my lines drawn, on this particular piece, and you see these with these older pieces that they do trace around the lines with ink. Now I'm not using the dip pen, I'm using a micron pen and I'm using gray. I'm going in once I get everything drawn and I'm going to erase all of my stray pencil marks. Now as far as brushes go, we're going to be using Royal and Langnickel. And right here I have a size 8, that's the bigger brush, and the smaller one I believe is a 3, maybe a 2. And then I have a scrubber brush, and that is going to be good. Those are synthetic bristles in that one. And that's going to be good for lifting out some highlights, or as I like to call it, erasing mistakes. It's a nice eraser. And then I have my Windsor and Newton Pocket Travel watercolors. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to use that larger brush. I do like to use, and I'll use the larger brush. I have the smaller one there, but I do like using the larger brush for almost everything. I am going to get some water first. We're going to be using several techniques, but I'm going to start with the pear. And I'm going to do one area at a time, and that's what I tell my students we need to do. We're going to do wet on wet. And I always tell my students it needs to be wet, it needs to be damp, but it doesn't need to be a puddle unless you're doing a special art technique that needs to be a puddle. But for our purposes, we're going to fill in the area. And just remember, no matter where the water is, that is where the paint will go. So I'm starting with a little yellow, and I'll have these colors across the screen for you there. And I'm putting a little bit of green in, and then another yellow to kind of brighten it up. Now this pear had 2 different colors in it that kind of mixed together in the middle. So I'm using 2 different shades there to come together and create that. And I'm getting my colors done ahead of time. There we go, so that I can put them over there and my water is just right on the paper to allow that watercolor to move. We don't want it to be too dark. And that's what I always tell my students. It's called watercolor for a reason. Water is first because you need more water than color. And you'll see because the paper is wet that color is going to move and flow together. It's going to allow me, I'm going to make that a little bit darker. It's going to allow me to come in and move that color over. I'm going to move some of the red over into the yellow because I decided I wanted to change that up just a bit. And then we're going to leave that area alone and let it dry while we move on to the leaves and do the same thing. So I'm adding a little more green here to my color because the leaves are just a bit different shade than we needed for the pear. The pear was a little more yellow-green, and we're going to make it a little bit darker by adding a little more green to it. And it's kind of a dance back and forth so you can get that right color. So once again, I'm going to do wet on wet on all of the leaves. And I'm just going to give a nice base color on each one. And now that we have finished those 3 leaves, I'm going to start on the 4th one, and you're going to see that I am adding white to it. That is because that's the back of the leaf. And the back of the leaf is always a tint of the front of the leaf. So I'm going to create that tint by adding white. And again, we're going to do wet on all of these. And then I'm going to take this and let it set to the side and dry. You can use a hair dryer if you want to hurry the process along, but this is cold pressed paper and water dries pretty quickly on it, and I'm actually doing this in front of a window that is open, and it is Arkansas in the summertime. So all I have to do is just set that in my windowsill and it dries pretty quickly for me. Now I do let each little area dry before I head to the next, because remember, wherever the water is, that's where the color is going to go. So if you don't want the brown from the 2 stems to bleed into that area of the green, then you're going to need to let that area dry. I am going to be doing a little bit different technique. We pre-mixed our colors for the leaves and for the pear, but this time I put down water and I'm going to mix my colors straight on the paper. So I'm putting down yellow first because the stem from my reference picture, the artist has created a stem that I can tell there's a little bit of yellow undertone to it. So I'm going to put that yellow down first, and then I'm going to come back and put the brown on top while it is still wet. That's going to allow those to bleed together, and I'm not going to have just one solid color. I'm going to have some mixing of the colors. So that was something I wanted to do on that. Now you can see that there are some areas on that last leaf that I did that are a little bit white. I'm going to come back in and fix those, and it's also come into my stem on the pear, and that is okay because the brown is going to cover that up. Now that all of our base layers have dried, we want it to be perfectly dry. We don't want, I tell the students, feel the paper. If it is cold, it is not dry. So make sure it is perfectly dry, room temperature paper. And I'm going to create the shadows and all of the little flecks on the pear and all the little veins on the leaves. So I'm going to pre-mix my colors for these. And then we're going to come back, and we're not going to wet the paper this time. We're going to do a technique called dry on dry. So you need to make certain that your color is what you want it to be. You want some water in your brush. It's a clean brush. Each time we change colors, we're going to have to clean our brush. Sometimes it's good to have 2 containers of water, so that you can have one that you clean the dirty off your brush and another one that you get water, clean water on your brush. And we're just going around where the shadows are. One thing about this technique, when you're coming back in dry on dry, and you, as I said earlier, this is cold pressed paper, so color dries fairly quickly. When you're adding that wet color right next to a dry color, what can happen is it's going to reactivate that previous color you put down, and you're going to get sort of a ballooning of your new color into that old color, and it's going to fade it out around the edges, and you're going to see this as things dry in some of the areas, but that's okay because we can come back with a damp brush and fix it, sort of like, and there is the scrubber brush, sort of like the edge right here. You can see I got a little bit out of the edge on stuff. I just come in with a damp brush and it's going to lift that straight off the paper. So we're going to keep mixing and we're going to get all of the details in on the stem. Now you may have noticed that I do not have black in my palette. That is because I do not like to use black. What I like to do to create dark colors is what I'm doing here to create the dark brown. Instead of taking brown and adding black, I'm adding one of the blues. And depending on the shade of brown I want, that kind of depends on which blue that I use to mix the color. And I'm also using the size 8 brush still, even though this is a fine area. If you will take your larger brushes and make sure they have a nice point to it, and you may have notice that I did this earlier. I took it and ran it between my fingers and kind of got that point before I got the paint on it. That will allow me to hold my brush almost perpendicular with the surface, and I can create some of those fine lines. At this point, we're getting all of that dark in there, but I don't want it to be such a hard edge between the two. So I'm coming back in with just a damp brush, like I mentioned earlier, and I am bringing that dry paint up into the wet paint. And that is going to create a nice blend. You can even take a little bit of the red, the dark red I created earlier, and run that from the pear up into the stem. Now we're going to start on the leaves, and we're going to go back and get all of the shading, and we're going to bring those veins into the leaves as well. Alright, we have the darker green coming in on the leaves, and I want to get the veins on the leaves, and they're not showing on both sides completely. So in order to recreate what the artist has done for this particular technique, I am painting in, I already have that nice light green base, so I'm coming back in with the darker and just leaving some spaces for the veins. So that is one technique of getting veins on the leaves. Now there is the other side that we're going to need to get the veins on as well, and I'm going to come back with a lifting technique, sort of like I did to erase the mistake I had on the outside of the pear. Now, while those leaves are drying, I'm going to come back in and add additional layers on top to kind of refine some of the shadow and the shapes that we need for the pear. Now again, we are adding the wet paint right next to that paint that is already sort of dry. I got it on fairly quickly, but the red was already a little bit dry. So I'm going to come back in a minute. As you can see, I've got extra water on my brush with that red, and I'm reactivating the red and allowing those two to come together. We are coming through with our third layer on top of the leaves, and again, this is going to allow us to define some of the veins and to get some darker colors in on those leaves. And this is the second technique that you can do for getting the veins on the leaves, because you're going to see this especially on the leaf that we're looking at the back of it, that fourth leaf. I'm going to come in, and instead of painting around the veins, I'm going to actually paint the veins on there. And then our final technique that you will see on the veins for the leaves, I'm going to come back and lift some color on the leaf I'm working on right now. On that opposite side, I'm going to lift some color to lift out the veins. Now that allows me to have kind of a more subtle vein in the leaf. What we did on this side of the leaf, where I painted around and just use my background to create those veins in the leaf, it's actually going to give me a softer vein. So the veins on those leaves were a little bit different in my reference photo, and that's why I chose to use two different techniques on this. And now we are going to work on the other side of those leaves, as I had mentioned earlier. Now some people will use on, if you have a lot of wet paint down, they will use the back of those brushes to make indentations and kind of pull up some color. But I'm using that fine brush, and it has clean water on it, and I've taken most of it off. It's not super wet. And as you can see, it is pulling off just little bits of the color, and that's what I want to do. I don't want those to be super noticeable like they are on the other side of the leaf. All right, now that we have all of the veins on our leaves, we're going to come back with that little scrubber brush I had mentioned earlier, and we're going to pull some highlights out in that pear. And as I said, this is also good if you don't use it too hard. What you're going to do with this brush is you're going to get it wet, and it's not going to have a lot of water on it. It's going to be kind of damp, but not too wet. And you can come back and kind of erase these areas. I'm also going to use it to tone down a little bit of the green on the other side. This pear had a little bit of a dark spot on it, and that's why I have the color pretty dark down at the bottom. Now you'll see what I'm doing is I'm coming back with kind of a cream that I've created, kind of a creamy color, and I'm doing the background. A lot of these antique paintings, botanical paintings, will have that kind of a cream light color in the background. The paper looks tinted, whether it's from being old or by design. I'm not sure. I didn't have the opportunity to see this up close. If you want to do your own study of artist techniques, you can take a look at Wikimedia Commons, and I'll put that down below. That is where I got the reference for all of my pieces. These were license free, so you can use them for whatever you want to use them for. So there is our pear. If you have any questions, please put those down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.